Hey, what's up everybody? Today I want to talk about sends in Logic, and I just did a video on busing and tried to explain it in the most simplest terms, and I'm going to try to do the same thing with sends. And they are similar in the sense that you want to use them basically to save space, but also sends are really good for mainly effects, so things like reverb and delay, doublers and stuff like that. Really any effect. And busing, for me anyway, talking about vocals more, but you could talk about guitars if you had multiple guitar tracks. I mainly use it because I want a vocal chain to be able to be used multiple times without losing space. So let's go to the last chorus. We are in Logic now, and I am going here because all the music drops out and it's just the vocal, and you can clearly hear that there's some delay and a little bit of reverb going on the vocal. And the problem with actually adding it into the vocal chain itself is that you're not going to be able to conserve as much space, and in my opinion it kind of muddies things up. Whereas you can see here when I have this reverb here, this H reverb, I'm actually EQing it beforehand, and you don't really have the ability to do that if you're actually putting it in the vocal chain. So I'm gonna go ahead and let you guys listen to this, and then I'll tell you what's going on here.
Everything you say, everything you do, everything I say, it comes back to you. I've been dreaming about your loving. So do you love me, darling?
So you can hear that little tail there. I'm actually going to solo it out and have you guys listen again, and just listen for the little bit of delay and reverb going on here.
Everything you say, everything you do, everything I say, it comes back to you. I've been dreaming about your loving. So do you love me, darling?
So the cool thing about reverb and delay is it adds width to the vocal, and I primarily have my vocals in mono, and then I'll have stereo effects. So you can see right here, this bus where I'm having all of the main plugins for the vocal is in mono, but when you go to the echo here and you go to the reverb, they're both in stereo, and I think it adds a lot of space and a lot of width. So the first thing, let me turn these off. I have an echo going on, and this is Echo Boy Jr. This is a plugin from Sound Toys, and their plugins are awesome. I actually use them all the time, quite frequently. I've done a few videos on their stuff. Little Altar Boy in particular is one of them that jumps out, but I like the CEQ, like all that. All their stuff's really good. So I like to use this as a delay. So let's listen to just a delay.
Everything you say, everything you do, everything I say, it comes back to you. I've been dreaming about your loving. So do you love me, darling?
So it's a very subtle slap delay, and you can see over here what I'm doing is I'm actually adjusting the send, and this is actually how much of the signal is being sent through. So the more you add here, the more of the effect you're going to get. But first off, I should probably show you how to actually add that. So I'm kind of jumping the gun here. So let's say that you were over here and you had your vocal chain done. Whether it's over here or it's over here, that doesn't really matter for now. Watch my video on busing, you'll understand why I tend to bus, and it's actually a similar reason for using sends. But if you go over here, let's say that's all done, and now you want to add a little bit of delay and reverb, which, by the way, I used to overuse all the time, and you might be doing this. You don't just slap a reverb on a vocal and just like add a ton of reverb. It's actually a much more subtle thing than you might realize, and I encourage you to go listen to records, especially pop records today or even hip hop. They actually don't use all that much reverb, and that's what I started to notice as time went on. I was using a lot of reverb, a lot of delay, because I just wanted it to sound cool, right? But it doesn't actually sound cool. What it does is it clouds up the mix, and it takes up too much space really, and it competes with other instruments. It just kind of ruins everything. So let's go ahead and add our first send, and I think what confuses people is the fact that this says bus, but you have to think of these as very similar things. Basically, buses are used mainly for me. I'll tell you how I use it, and people might use them for different things, but buses for me mainly I use for vocals, or if I have multiple guitar tracks or multiple of the same instrument but I'm trying to affect in the same way. And mainly this is EQ and compression that are going on buses for me. And I think of sends, which by the way are the same thing. All right, let me try to explain this, because basically if I go up here to bus 1, this is my main bus, and you can see that this is being routed to bus 1 because it's my main vocal chain. I'm not going to put the bus over here in the sends. So these columns are for sends right here. I'm not going to be adding a signal of what I already have as the vocal chain. So you don't want to do that. That makes no sense to do that. This is only for adding effects. So we're going to create a new bus or a send. The send is based on where it is. This is the send right here because it's in these slots. If I was to route this to bus 22 and I created a new vocal chain, well, this would now be bus 22. But this over here, let's get rid of this and go back to, let's just put this on stereo out for the heck of it so you guys actually understand what's happening here. But if you go to create a new bus or a new send, you are going to click this right here, and now this is your send. You're going to want to go up here, put this in stereo most likely. If you're adding stereo effects, you don't have to. If you want to keep it really tight, then you don't have to. But if you're going to add a delay or a reverb, you would go up here after adding this. Send 23, I guess is what you could call it. It is sort of a confusing thing really, but it's not. Once you do it over and over again, it's really not confusing. It's very simple, but when you first get into it, it might confuse you. But let's call this send 23 instead of bus. Even though it says bus, let's call it send 23. And you're going to go over here, because now this is routed to send 23. That's what I'm going to call that. And we're going to go to a reverb for the heck of it. So let's say you're in Logic and you pull up reverb. You're going to want the mix at 100%. And you can see they already have that at 100%, anticipating the fact that you're going to be using it as a send. And some people might argue this, but ordinarily I use the wetness at 100% when I'm using sends. Some people don't, but I tend to do that, and if I put it in an actual vocal chain or on an instrument, I'll adjust the wetness versus the dry. But I don't do that if it's a send. So now what we are going to do is we're able to push through more of that reverb to give it more of an effect or less of an effect. So let's just listen to this soloed.
Everything you say, everything you do, everything I say comes back to you. I've been dreaming about your loving. So do you love me, darling?
See, I wouldn't go much more than right there, but that is the difference between a send and a bus, is basically you're going to be pushing through this signal that is primarily going to be a delay or a reverb, and you're going to be able to adjust it right here by scrolling up or down. That closer to 0 is going to give you more of an effect, and closer to negative infinity, I guess is what they call it, then you're going to have less of an effect. Now this is also going to appear when you click the X button and you go down here to your auxiliary tracks. So this is the send right here that we just created, and it's always helpful when you first create them to actually go down here and label this. I'm guilty of not doing that. You can see down there with the yellow, I've labeled some of them I have not. So let's say that we're gonna label this reverb. So now when we go to the bus, it's actually going to be labeled, and we'll be able to tell what we're doing. And that's going to allow you to actually go to multiple different sources. So let's say I knew that I wanted the verse to have the same exact reverb. Well, I would go here and I would go to chroma verb, and then I would adjust it accordingly and try to get it to the same exact send as the other vocal take. But the reason I mentioned these over here is because you can actually adjust how much of the reverb is going on over here as well. So let's listen to this again.
Everything you say, everything you do, everything I say, it comes back to you. I've been dreaming about your loving.
So you can see over here, this green, this is how much of the signal's actually passing through, and you can dial this back too.
Everything you say, everything you do, everything I say, it comes back to you.
Another cool thing that you can do is actually solo this out and then mute the lead vocal. Ordinarily, I would do this on something like backing vocals, and I don't even really do it very often. But if we were to go to hook lead, let me just find
everything you say, everything you do.
That's right here. You can see that this is soloed out. But if I take this out, but I keep this soloed here, all we're going to get is the effect, which can be actually very cool for adding to certain instruments to get an ambient sort of sound.
Everything you say, everything you do, everything I say comes back to you. I've been dreaming about your loving.
And I've probably already confused you guys, but don't be confused and don't get annoyed with sends or buses. I try to break them down as simply as I can, but you're going to be confused no matter what. I know that I was when I first heard explanations of both of them, and I didn't understand why I would do that, and ignorant me just blew it off, but it actually is a very, very important and useful thing to use sends and to use buses. So get into it, learn about it. If you haven't seen my video on busing, I definitely recommend checking it out. And I'm going to keep this video relatively short. So if you guys got something out of the video, please subscribe to the channel. I really appreciate it. It helps the channel to grow. And I'll see you in the next one. Peace.